Okay, so several of these chapters we can cover relatively quickly, starting with chapter 8, which isn't actually on the syllabus really. So you don't have to read it. There's one, and it's a long chapter. It's interesting. I encourage you to read it, but it's not on the syllabus. It's not required. Part sentence in particular that I wanted to focus on, very kind of typical for Hobbes, very representative of the way that he thinks. Chapter 8, section 16. He says, "For the thoughts are to the desires as scouts and spies, to range abroad and find the way to the things desired. All steadiness of the mind's motion and all quickness of the same proceeding from thence." So he says basically, again, the thoughts are to the desires as scouts and spies, to range abroad, find the way to the things desired. And again, all steadiness of the mind's motion, all quickness of the same, proceeding from that. So basically, again, the idea, why do we think? What is human thought? What is the purpose of human thought? Where does it come from? Why do we think? To think of how to satisfy our desires, to think of how to get what we want. The thoughts, as he puts it there, like scouts and spies, going out, going abroad to find out, okay, where are things? How do we get to them? How does that work? And as he says, all steadiness and all quickness of the mind comes from the same. It's when you really want something that's when you think, Hobbes says. That's when, again, steadiness, that's when a sense of purpose sets in or is established, in quickness. That's when you really start to think quickly, to think seriously, determinedly about something. This goes back, we saw this in chapters 3 and 5, for instance, but a very good statement here of this idea that, again, that ultimately human thought, again, we saw he sort of briefly acknowledges the possibility of curiosity, love of knowledge, love of understanding for its own sake. But for the most part, this is the picture of human thought and of human nature in general that Hobbes has. People think for practical reasons. They think to satisfy their desires. So again, we've also seen the way that he sort of disagrees with Aquinas, what he says sort of against Aquinas, the idea that reason does not identify the good. We'll see this even more clearly in chapter 11. But reason does not reflect on ends. Reason does not identify the good for human beings. The desires identify certain things as desirable or fearful or things to be avoided, and then reason thinks about how to make that happen. Reason thinks about how to get the things that we desire and how to avoid the things that we're afraid of. So very different picture, obviously, of what human reason is, how it's related to the desires, and so on. Very different between Hobbes and Aquinas. Okay. Chapter 9, classification of the different forms of knowledge or of science. It's interesting. The difference is this edition contains both the English and a translation of from the Latin edition, which are somewhat different. It's interesting to compare them, to look at what Hobbes thinks science is, the relations between the sciences, and so on. But we're not really going to dwell on that. Chapter 10, basically about really the argument of chapter 10 is that power is at the center of human life. Chapter 10, titled "Of Power, Worth, Dignity, Honor, and Worthiness." So of power, but also of worth, dignity, honor. What do all these things mean? Hobbes says worth, dignity, honor. When we're doing all these things, what we're really doing is basically indicating in somewhat indirect but fairly obvious ways how much power we think someone has. Things like honor and dignity and these things, Hobbes says, are really just about power. And these things are just ways of expressing in very concrete, very clear, unmistakable terms what power relations are between people. He has that whole list, and it's often quite funny, of ways that you can honor or dishonor someone. Of course, instructors or teachers recognize many of the things from the list of ways to dishonor somebody, to talk while they're talking, to go forth, as he puts it, just to get up and leave. Of course, there was no cell phones in Hobbes' day, but if there were, of course, he would say, to text while someone else is talking to you, that's a sign of dishonor. And again, what he's saying is that when you respect somebody, when you honor them, you show that you think that they have more power than you, or at least in some particular situation they have power, and you need their good opinion. You need them to think well of you, to be happy with you and not angry. Hobbes says, whereas when you dishonor somebody, you're not really saying anything about their inherent worth as a person. You're just saying, I don't think that I need you. I don't think that you can really harm me in any way. And I don't think there's anything that I really need from you that I can get. And he says, that's really what's at the center of human life, are all of these relations of power. And, you might say, well, why? Why is he so obsessed with this? Isn't that a little bit almost kind of creepy? And again, just sort of, is it too focused on one particular aspect of human existence? And Hobbes says, again, kind of goes back to this idea that there is no permanent good. That things are constantly changing. We all sense that. We all sense that there's no one thing, no one person, no one situation that's going to make us permanently happy, and therefore we're sort of constantly aware that what we need is power. What we need is the way to get what we want, because we know that what we want is always going to change. Therefore, our interactions with other people, according to Hobbes, we're not primarily treating them as human beings. We're not primarily treating them as human beings who have their own dignity and deserve to be treated as equals and so on. Hobbes says we're really treating them as means to our ends. And again, that's how you see how you treat people. It's about, well, how much power do I think that they have? What can I get away with them? How obviously self-interested and callous and indifferent can I be to them, considering how much power they have over me? One of the famous definitions of morality came from Immanuel Kant, who said, what is it to be moral is to treat other people as ends in themselves rather than just as means to your own end. And Hobbes here is effectively saying people don't do that. They never do that. Now again, you might say, isn't that an overstatement? Isn't he overstating? And again, isn't he being too reductive? Isn't human moral experience, emotional experience, all kinds of things, isn't it all much more complicated and richer and much sort of again more nuanced and more interesting than Hobbes makes it out here to be? And again, if that's the case, then isn't that a serious problem for Hobbes? Because again, isn't the whole idea here that he's basing his political ideas on human nature, on having sort of seen himself, read himself, known other people? Remember the claims from the introduction. And again, Hobbes may come back and say that might be true to some extent. I may be overstating, but if you found on these ideas, if you found on the ideas that people will ultimately be selfish and concerned with getting what they want, and therefore concerned, seeing other people primarily in terms not as partners in society or partners in pursuit of virtue or something like that, but as means to their end, Hobbes might say if you base your ideas, and in particular your political ideas, your political organizations and institutions and so on that understanding of human nature, you will rarely be wrong. If you try to base your politics on the notion of human beings as heroic and self-sacrificing and high-minded and noble and so on, if you try to base a politics on a form of politics, a system of laws, political institutions and so on the idea that human beings should and will treat each other as ends in themselves rather than simply as means to their ends, Hobbes will say that's not going to work out very well. People don't act that way. And what's worse, when they start to think of politics that way, then of course you get into a situation where there's no real room for compromise. If politics is ultimately about the ultimate human good and so on, then there's very little room for compromise, because what you're compromising over are the most important things. If politics is primarily just about getting what you want in a very prudential, calculating way, then of course, almost by definition, almost by the very nature of it, there's going to be a lot of compromise, because again, what you're doing is not trying to pursue the ultimate good, but simply sort of calculate and sort of scheme and arrange something that will ultimately be good for you in getting what you want, but again, in a relatively mild way. And again, so you might think of, you might compare this to some of the Federalist Papers, for instance, Federalist 10. And why do people enter politics? Because of factions. What are factions? They're ultimately selfish. Why do people enter politics? Because of selfish concern with their own property and so on. Federalist 51. How do you create an effective constitution? By finding public-spirited people, or by educating your citizens to be virtuous, so that when they take power, they exercise that power with virtue and public-spiritedness and so on? No. Federalist 51 says accept that people are going to be ambitious, accept that they're going to be power-hungry, and set up a system of government where as the famous phrase, ambition counteracts ambition. The different branches are checking each other, stopping the other branches from becoming too powerful, because that means that if I'm the president, I'm going to stop Congress from becoming too powerful, not because I care about freedom or about the American people or about the public good or anything, but because if Congress becomes more powerful, I become less powerful. That's the way the system is set up. And then you see something like that here with Hobbes, where he's basically saying human life isn't really ultimately about virtue. It's not about a sort of higher good that we need to come together and form partnerships and cooperate to help each other pursue that and attain that good. Hobbes says human life again is ultimately about people being fairly selfish, and that can be very dangerous, but it can also, if you understand it, if you understand how to manage it correctly, it can actually be the foundation for a relatively peaceful and even somewhat reasonable and humane society. So anyway, so chapter 10, again, power at the center of human life. Typical kind of funny Hobbesian phrase about this, talks about how ultimately, everybody thinks that they're the most important person in the world. But he says you can see how much power someone really has by the way that other people treat them. As he puts it, and as in other things, so in men, not the seller but the buyer determines the price. For let a man, as most men do, rate themselves at the highest value they can, yet their true value is no more than it is esteemed by others. So again, he says, in other things, if you're selling a 30-year-old car that doesn't have a bumper, you can ask for $10,000 for it, but no one's going to pay that. He says, it's not the seller but the buyer who decides on the price. At the same time, individuals may rate themselves at the highest value that they can. They may think they're the most important people in the world, or at least the most important people in their immediate surroundings. But again, he says that their true value is no more than it is esteemed by others. How do other people actually treat them? That's how you see, again, how much value they have. Where Hobbes is saying, again, your value as a person is really based on how much value other people think you have, how much value they think that you have, because of how much they estimate you can actually help or harm them. So again, chapter 10, power at the center of human life, and again, this is ultimately because there isn't this ultimate good human being sense. We're ultimately all on our own, and so we constantly need to be ready to shift for ourselves and to get what we want, and that's why there's so much focus on power, not particular substantial goods, but power, the ability to get whatever we want. Again, as he said earlier, happiness in this life is simply always continual success in obtaining what you want, continual success in obtaining what you desire. Money in a sense would be the symbol for what Hobbes means here by power. Something that by itself isn't anything in particular, but can be used to get all kinds of things, because again, what you want will change radically throughout your life. What will make you happy is the ability to get whatever you want, knowing that it will keep changing. So again, for Aquinas, happiness is doing what is genuinely good, having that actual good, experiencing that. For Hobbes, happiness is just continually getting what you want, and therefore, again, power is what is important. Have the ability to get whatever you want, knowing that it will always change, because there is no ultimate good. Nothing is inherently good in itself, and therefore nothing can be the ultimate or final focus for human endeavor or action.